Hello everyone, in this video we're going to talk about how we can answer certain questions for non-Mendelian genetics. The first question is how many autosomes are in a human somatic cell? So in a human somatic cell, as you should have already known, there are 23 pairs of chromosomes in total. So out of those 23 pairs with 46 chromosomes, we have one X and one Y chromosome for a male as sex chromosome, or two X's as the sex chromosome for a female. So the answer to over here should be two sex chromosomes, and if you do the math, 46 minus 2 would have been 44, right? So you should have 44 autosomes in the somatic cell and two sex chromosomes in a somatic cell. So if you're looking at a gamete, however, because instead of 23 pairs of chromosomes, you would only have 23 chromosomes, so then you would have 22 autosomes and one sex chromosome. It could either be X or Y for a male, and it would just be an X chromosome for a female. For number 2, it says which chromosome, the X or the Y chromosome, carries more genes. So the X chromosomes are longer than the Y chromosomes. So with all this space, all the DNA nucleotides, it will carry a whole lot more genes and codes for a lot more traits and proteins than the Y chromosome. Number 3, what are the sexes and eye color for flies with the following genotype? So if white eye is recessive, red eye is dominant. I forgot to write that, but the idea is red eye is dominant, okay? So whenever you do a sex-linked question, you always want to write out the notation. So normally in the past, you would do big A, little a, for example, or big R, little r, whatever. Can you see? All right, this is better. So in this case, normally you would do big R, little r, right, for dominant versus recessive. Close the line a little bit. There we go. Big R, little r. For dominant versus recessive. However, if you had a sex-linked gene, which means this gene, instead of being located on an autosome, it will be located on a sex chromosome. So how does that work? Instead of just, here we go, just big R and little r, you will do X big R and X little r. That's the only two possibilities. If you have X big R, that means it's a dominant allele located on the X chromosome. And if you have an X little r, that's a recessive allele located on an X chromosome. Okay? And there wouldn't be anything on the Y chromosome. It would just be Y. Okay? So if you had a male, you have X and Y, because that's what makes you a male. That's your sex chromosome. Because there are two possibilities for the X linked gene, you have either the dominant or the recessive. You can have X big R or X little r Y. That's the only two possibilities for a male. So if you had an X big R Y, what does that mean to you? That means you have the dominant trait. So if we're talking about the fruit flies, X big R Y will be red eye, and X little r Y would have white eye. Okay. It gets slightly more complicated for the female because instead of just having the dominant or the recessive possibilities, you have two X chromosomes. So you have X and X. So that creates three different possibilities. You can have X big R, that's your homozygous dominant, or you can also call it purebred, right? So if you carry two X chromosomes that both have the dominant allele, big R, you will definitely show the dominant trait. So in this case, that will be red eye. The other two possibilities are X big R, X little r, because you have two X chromosomes, you can have one dominant and one recessive. So if you have X big R and X little r, that's going to give you, there we go, red eye as well, because if you had a dominant allele and a recessive allele, the dominant is going to cover out the recessive, so you'll still show the dominant trait. So X big R, X little r is still going to be red. The third possibility is X little r, X little r. So you're carrying two recessive alleles, and if you're carrying two recessive alleles, that's the only time that you can actually show the recessive trait. So the eye color will be white. Another way that we can call X big R, X little r, or anytime you can have the dominant trait, right? You can show the dominant trait, but you're also holding on to a recessive allele. We can call that a carrier. Okay? So if a question were to tell you this is a carrier of the gene, that is always talking about a heterozygote individual. But remember, for a male X-linked trait, you cannot have a carrier at all because you can't be heterozygous. When you have only X and Y, you either have X big RY, you have X little RY. Those are the only two possibilities. So that's our third question. So if you take a look at this question one more time, this one should have been red. This is red, and white. These two are males and these three are females. So you need to be able to write out all these possibilities. That's the only 5 combinations that any question can have. For number 4, what are the genotypes of the flies? Right? So this is kind of going backward. If you had a wide-eyed male, the genotype has to be this one. A wide-eyed female, the genotype has to be this one because this is the recessive genotype for a male, and this is the recessive genotype for a female. If you had a red-eyed female, it could either be X big R, X little r, or X big R, X big R. But if it were to ask you for the heterozygote individual or the carrier, then the answer would be X big R and X little r. A red-eyed male would just be X big R Y. So you need to go back and forth from the genotype to the phenotype or a phenotype to the genotype. Number 5, can a male be a carrier of an X-linked trait? The answer should be no, right? Like I said, if you only have X and Y, you get one shot of the X chromosome is either X big RY or X little RY. There is no other possibility. How many possible genotypes are there for a female, right? If you look right here, there are 3 different possibilities for a female. If it's X-linked, right? If you don't have X-linked, it doesn't matter whether it's a male or a female, then you would just have big A, big A, big A, little A, little A, little A. Those are the 3 possibilities for an autosomal gene, but right now we're talking about X-linked. How many for a male? These 2 are for the male. So you have to remember, you have to write, when we talk about sex-linked, you have to make it very clear, right? If you just write big R, little r, that doesn't work because you're not accounting for whether an individual is a male or a female and whether the offspring is a male or a female. So that's number 5. Number 6, a male, okay, so now if you think about it, you think about an offspring and where it gets everything from, right? So let's talk about a male. X, Y. If you're a male, you have to get your Y chromosome from dad, right? The reason for that is because dad is the only one that carries Y chromosome in the first place. So the only kind of Y chromosome, or the only way that you can get a Y chromosome at all is dad. The other X chromosome, as a result, has to come from mom because mom carries X chromosome. You can get another X chromosome from mom as well, right? And then that will make you a female. So if you were to be a female, you have XX. Everybody is come from the father and the mother. So one X chromosome comes from mom, one X chromosome comes from dad, right? So the result is, in order for your gender to be determined, your biological sex to be determined, that has to be the dad's job, right? Whether the sperm carries an X or a Y chromosome is what determines whether you're a boy or a girl, okay? So if you think about a boy, right? If you're a male, your sex-linked traits are completely determined by mom. Whatever mom passes on was the X chromosome, whatever genes that are carried on the X chromosome, that is all you get because the Y chromosome doesn't carry that gene, right? Because right now we're just talking about X-linked. So this should be mom, dad, mom, and dad, okay? So for number 7, right, when you look at number 7, you might feel a little bamboozled because it doesn't tell you what the dad is, right? But if you could understand number 6 and what I just explained, you should be able to answer number 7 just fine. So number 7 says, if a mother is homozygous dominant, right? So whenever you read these words, you have to translate it into genotypes. If a mom is a homozygous dominant, the genotype of the mom has to be X big R, or whatever letter that you use is X, and X was the dominant allele with the capitalized letters, right? And then what will the son carry as a trait, right? So if you think about a son, again, is X and Y. Y comes from dad, right? But we didn't tell you what the dad has. Is the dad dominant or recessive? It doesn't matter because the dad is going to give you your Y chromosome and your X chromosome is completely dependent on mom. So if mom only has X big R, that means the only kind of X chromosome that you can get is X big R. That means you're going to have the dominant trait, right? So right here, it doesn't tell you what specifically the trait is, but you should know that the trait of the son will be a dominant trait, okay? And then it says if a mom is homozygous recessive, right? So it's the same idea. If mom is homozygous recessive instead of X big R, you should immediately write down on your paper that this means X little r and X little r, right? And now we're looking at a son again. A son is X and Y. Y comes from dad. So dad is useless in this case. We don't care whether the dad has the dominant trait or the recessive trait. It doesn't matter. Okay, and then that means you can only get the recessive allele from mom, because that's the X chromosome that you're getting is from mom, and mom only carries the recessive version of the trait. That means you can only be X little ry. Okay, so what would the trait of the son be? That has to be recessive. If a mother is heterozygous, so heterozygous means mom is now a carrier of the recessive allele, or a heterozygous, that means you are X big R and X little r. So that means as a son, right, you're getting this gene from mom, so that means you can get either one, right? You can have X big RY, that's possible, but you can also be X little ry, because during the formation of gamete, these two alleles are going to separate, right? You're going to separate the two. You are either going to get X big RY, what did I just say? X big R, or you're going to get X little r. And you're going to either have the dominant trait or the recessive trait. So the answer for this one will be either one. Okay. Now let's do a few crosses of actual examples so that you can do that successfully on the test. So when we look at a cross between a purebred, so a purebred means it's homozygous. It says red eye, so that means it's the dominant. In this case, right, on the question I'll tell you which one is dominant and which one is recessive. So in this case, the red eye is dominant. So that means we have a red eye female, right? So whenever you look at the word female for an X linked, you have to write down X first, right? Because that's what makes a female is that is XX. So we have XX, and it says purebred red eye, so it has to be X big R. And then we have a white-eyed male, and sometimes students would ask, is a white-eyed male, is it homozygous or heterozygous? Is it dominant or recessive, right? We already know it's a male, so you first want to write down X and Y, right? And then it's white eye, so that means it's recessive. It doesn't matter whether it's homozygous or heterozygous. First off, there is no such thing as a heterozygous male for X-linked, because you can only have the recessive allele or the dominant allele. You just get one. So if you know it's white eye, that means it's recessive. So the genotype for the male will be X little r and Y. Okay. So now you set up your Punnett square. Now you fill it out. We put the letters together. We put this letter here, S big R, X little r. Same thing over here. You drag the letter down, drag the letter across, X big R, Y. Same thing, X big R, X little r, and then you fill in the last box. You drag this letter down, drag this letter across. We have X big R and Y, okay? So there are 4 possibilities of the offspring. That's what a Punnett square tells you are the possibilities, right? It doesn't mean that if you have 4 children, these are the 4 you're going to get. These are what are the chances of each one of these genotype, right? Okay. So what are the genotype of the parents? You can already write it down. What percentages are? Again, on a question, you want to make sure to read. Are you being asked what percentages are white-eyed male, for example, out of all the offspring, or white-eyed male out of just the males, okay? So the question will tell you. In this case, what I'm looking for, I'll be very clear on the test, but in this case, what I'm looking for is out of all the offspring. So if you're looking for a white-eyed male, that has to be XY. So we have XY right here. Are any of them white-eye? So if you think about it, white-eye means it has to be X little ry. Do I see any X little ry here at all, right? We don't see any of that, so the answer to this will be 0. And then it's asking for a white-eyed female. A white-eyed female has to be X little r. So you have to be really comfortable with what we did with these two questions before you can even move on to these type of questions, right? So white-eyed female will be X little r, X little r. Do we see any of that? No. So the answer is 0 as well. A red-eyed male, first off, is XY, meaning it's a male, and it has to be X big RY, since it's showing the dominant trait, right? Do I see a red-eyed male? I see 2 of those out of 4, so 2 divided by 4 equals to 50%. So in this case, it will be 50%, right? And lastly, it's asking for red-eyed female out of all the offspring, right? Then both of these are red-eyed female because they are heterozygous, and heterozygote individuals will show the dominant trait. So it will be 2 out of 4 again, and that will be 50%, right? So here's the thing. If this question were to ask you, what is the percentage of red-eyed male out of all the male, right? That answer is going to change because instead of looking at all 4 squares, you're just looking at the male. Again, if I were to say red-eyed male out of all the male, right? So these are all the male. We're just looking at these 2 squares. We don't even care what's going on up here. It's out of all the male. So if you're looking at the red-eyed male out of all the male, you see 2 out of 2. So instead of 2 out of 4, you will do 2 out of 2. Then the answer will change to 100%, right? So you got to be careful what the question is asking you. Now let's look at one more example. Oh. In this example, it says we have a red-eyed female who's a heterozygous or a carrier, right? So either way, whether the question tells you it's heterozygous or the question tells you it's red eye, you should be able to answer it. So wait, heterozygous or a carrier, either way you should be able to answer it. So this female is XX, that's what makes it a female, and then if it's heterozygous or a carrier, it has to be X big R, X little r. And then it's asking for a red-eyed male, so male has to be X and Y. If it's a red-eyed male, that means it's showing the dominant trait, which means it has a dominant allele on the X chromosomes. That has to be X big RY. That's the only possibility. And it asks, what are the genotype of the parents? The genotype of the parents, you can already write it down. Now we're going to fill out the Punnett Square. Again, you just move the letter down, move the letter across, you put it in a box. So right here we have X big R, X big R, X big R, X little r, X big R, Y, and X little r, Y. These are our 4 possibilities for the offspring. These are all the chances that we can get. It's a little slanted. I apologize. All right, so now we look at the offspring and we're going to answer the question. White-eyed male. So now you're looking at a male. There are 2 of these male. Which one is the white-eyed, right? The white-eyed male will be this one. This is a white-eyed male, right? So that's 1 out of, if the question asks you white-eyed male out of all the offspring, that would be 1 out of 4. So that would be 25%. And then what about the white-eyed female? White-eyed female has to be X little r, X little r. Do you see any X little r's at all? You don't, right? So that has to be 0 out of 4, and that the answer will be 0. And then it's asking for a red-eyed male. So this one is the red-eyed male. Again, is 1 out of 4. Out of all the children, it would be 1 out of 4. If I were to say red-eyed male out of all the male, then that would be 1 out of 2, right? So in this case, the answer will be 25% again. And lastly, we have red-eyed female. Both this female and this female are red-eyed. So that will be 2 out of 4, and the answer will be 50%, right? Lastly, okay, so this last question is a little bit of a step up, but you can do it. It says if 100 males were produced and 200 females were produced, how many total red-eyed flies will there be? Right? There's a difference between male and female, so you have to look at each one of these individually. So this first part says 100 males, right? So now you're looking at just out of the males instead of out of all the children, right? Both of these are male. If you're looking at the chances of male being red-eyed, that will be 1 out of 2, right? Let me trace the bottom part. So if you're just looking at, you already know they're males, right? You have 100 males, but out of all the male, only 1 out of 2 will be able to have the red eyes. So only 50 of these males would have red eyes, right? And then we said there are 200 females, So out of these 200 females, every single female that you can get had red eyes. So that means that's 2 out of 2, right, for the females. So that means all 200 females will have red eyes. Together, you should have 250 flies in total for the male and the female that have red eye, right? So you got to be careful because earlier, these questions were asking for red-eyed male or females out of all the offspring, but now we're talking about out of just the male and just the female, right? So you can't use the percentage that you came up with earlier anymore. So that's all for sex linked. I hope these questions are helpful. Good luck.